This meeting is being recorded.
Hi, and welcome to Dip In and Out with Lucy, the podcast that opens up the discussion around domestic abuse. You can find all the podcasts and blogs and now guest blogs over on my website, ydom.co.uk. I'm here this morning with the amazing Amanda. And Amanda's going to explain a bit about her role in terms of domestic abuse, sexual violence specialist in older people and learning and physical disability. So Amanda, if you'd like to tell a bit more about your role.
Hi, thank you for having me on your podcast.
Oh.
I have sort of two hats in my role, really. I have my day job where I work for Cambridgeshire County Council, and I'm part of the Domestic Abuse and Sexual Violence Partnership there. My role there is that I lead on communications and awareness raising, and also anything to do with older people or people with learning and physical disabilities. But then outside of work, I'm an independent consultant and researcher, basically around the same topics where older people and people with physical and learning disabilities are affected by domestic abuse and sexual violence.
Amazing, absolutely amazing. Like that isn't enough.
Exactly, yeah.
many hats. Yes, and because obviously we were talking the other day, and one thing you talked about was a project that you're working on, which does sound amazing and sounds extremely interesting. So if you would be happy to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. It's good timing actually, because next week is Carers Week.
Yes.
And the project I'm working on is around domestic abuse and unpaid carers. And it came about because of there's been an increase that I've noticed in domestic homicide reviews that have involved an unpaid carer, either as the victim or as a perpetrator. And it got me thinking about the complexities really about the caring relationships. And something that seemed to be a pattern in domestic homicide reviews involving carers was that often the professionals involved weren't aware of the caring relationship, and often they weren't aware that that caring relationship was struggling, basically. So that's the reason that I've decided to do this project. So in terms of the main thing I'm looking at is carers as victims of domestic abuse from the person that they're caring for.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a controversial area. It's often assumed that if somebody has care and support needs, that they couldn't be abusive. But actually that abuse could have been going on for a long time in that relationship. And it's just that the caring relationship is more recent.
Yeah.
So that wouldn't necessarily stop the abuse. But there are also some cases where due to somebody's support needs, which could be around dementia or could be around medication that they take, that their behaviour does actually change and can become abusive due to either the illness itself or changes due to medication, or because of the fear of dementia. It could sort of make somebody's behaviour more abusive.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's basically what the research and project is around.
That's amazing, and it's such a difficult subject, like you say, isn't it? Especially unpaid carers, and if say it's obviously a family member, that abuse, like I say, could have gone on for a very long time. And also, just because somebody then develops a condition doesn't mean that the person who's been abused is all of a sudden going to stop feeling that, because we know it becomes quite normalized for the victim that they are, living this life. This is how it is. And then I suppose in a way as well, there could also be the idea that because this person now is, ill, that pressure there is even more so to, not leave, not kind of leave them without any support. So there's so much more pressure on the unpaid carer, definitely. And also various ages as well, isn't it? Because we always think of the carer as being somebody maybe that's a bit older, but it can also be people who are younger as well. So You know, I never realised in terms of school children, it took me a long time. Somebody had said it not so long ago, and I was thinking, you know, you don't realise that actually somebody that's trying to go to school, secondary school, day in, day out, goes home at the end of the day and first thing in the morning, and they're caring for a parent or, you know, helping to care for a sibling. It's a minefield.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Carers UK say from their research that around 58% of carers are women, and a lot of them are working as well, so often trying to hold down a job and provide care as well. And I think you just touched on some of the complexities around if a carer who's being abused speaks out about what's happening, and some of those fears about what could happen to you know, the person they're caring for, really. And I think that's why it's often, whilst domestic abuse as a whole is not talked about as much as it should be, I think particularly when there are all these additional you know, complexities around the relationship, that's carers and domestic abuse is talked about even less.
Yeah, and that's the thing, I suppose. There's, you know, there's always the shame factor with abuse, regardless of what type of abuse. You know, if it's one particular area like financial abuse, or whether it's physical, or whether it's emotional, psychological, you know, there is always that shame attached. And I suppose as well, you know, as human beings, most of us want to care for somebody and want to, you know, whether it's our parents as they get older, whether it's our children, whoever it is, our kind of instinct is to be compassionate and caring. So if somebody's been abusive towards you, you're probably likely to make excuses and say, oh, they didn't mean that, especially if you, like you say, the abuse has been going on for a long time, and that just becomes normal in that household, that relationship, that actually you'll make excuses for it just because, you know, you feel that you have to take care of that person. But who's taking care of the carer, you know? And what, just out of interest, I'm fascinated, is what sort of support, because obviously it's an area I'm not familiar with, and this is precisely why I wanted to do this, because it's so good to open this up to professionals of every area around domestic abuse, because then, you know, like me, there are other people that don't know the complexities of every particular area. So in terms of the carer themselves, do they get, even if they haven't disclosed abuse, do they have support? Or I suppose, would they know where to get support if they thought that they might potentially be able to look out, you know, for someone or somebody to, you know, be there for them? I don't know.
So yeah, I mean, under the Care Act, which came in 2014, carers are entitled to a carers assessment, which is an assessment of their needs as a carer, in their own right, independent from the person that they're caring for. But that relies on them actually being aware that they can have a carers assessment. Usually if somebody is working with adult social care, then they will refer them for a carers assessment. But not all carers are known as carers, not all carers identify themselves as carers. So that is often a big gap, that they don't get that carers assessment. And even if they do get the assessment, it's often done alongside the person they're caring for, which makes it less likely for them to disclose. When they're there. And there aren't any questions that ask specifically about
that's interesting
on a carers assessment either.
Because how do you, if they're together, like you say, how do you then, you know, sort of say to that person, do you feel like you're being supported? They're going to say, yes, I'm fine. Yeah,
exactly. And in terms of when we just discussed about historical abuse that might have been going on for a long time, a carers assessment is based on the needs now. It doesn't look back at the sort of history of that relationship, really. So it's good that people are entitled to that carers assessment, but it perhaps doesn't cover areas of domestic abuse, really, and it could do.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, we all try and talk about the fact that domestic abuse isn't discussed enough, you know, breaking down those stigmas, breaking down those barriers and talking about it. But when you start peeling away the layers and realize, actually, you know, we may have ideas of what we think it's all about, but actually there are people who are in the situation where, you know, where do you go for support if you're a carer? How do you even know you're being subjected to abuse, experiencing abuse, you may not even realize. And that's why I think it's so important that it becomes more and more obvious in terms of talking about domestic abuse in day-to-day society, that maybe somebody would see something, read something and go, actually, hang on a minute, that's precisely how I'm treated. And where do I go? That'd be an interesting one actually to put on the, I'm just thinking now in terms of the resources page, where you go if you are a carer, where you go for support, because that's just made me think, the resources page is going to end up being as long as you are, because it's just going to keep growing, which is brilliant. But, for that element, where do people go if you are a carer, an unpaid carer, and where do you go? Or if you're a paid carer, where do you go to get that support, sort of thing, if you don't really know what's going on in terms of your own life, because it's so normalised. Yeah, right. We'll do that. We'll get that on.
There is definitely a gap there. And because even if a carer does, they recognise that they're experiencing abuse and they do want to talk to somebody about it. First of all, they've got a huge number of concerns themselves about what will happen if they do talk to somebody about it. There's the guilt that it might seem that they can't care for that person, that can't care for their loved one anymore, worried about how far things will go. Will the police be involved? Obviously, most people wouldn't want to call the police on a family member.
No, of course not.
And also how that could change the caring situation. Would it be that it's advised that caring has to stop and strangers are brought in as carers from an agency, or that the loved one might even have to be placed into a care home? And so when you're sort of weighing it up, there are a lot more reasons not to speak out about it when you're a carer than what there are. And I think when and if you do speak out about it, there are very limited resources to support carers as well. There's a sort of a common misconception that support for carers comes under adult safeguarding. And I think a lot of professionals would think, well, it's a referral to adult safeguarding, but actually there are criteria set out by the Care Act, and the person being referred to the safeguarding team has to have care and support needs in their own right, and those care and support needs must prevent them from being able to protect themselves from abuse. And that thing about whether someone has care and support needs can be a very fine line, whereas a lot of people would think, well, someone who is a carer would have their own care and support needs just by the fact that they're caring, but actually that isn't the case. So adult safeguarding isn't the usual route that they would get support. Equally, domestic abuse specialist services are often not aware of the complexities of the caring role. And usually the main goal from working with a domestic abuse support service is for that relationship to end, thus ending the abuse. But a lot of the time with a caring relationship, it's not the relationship they want to end. They want the abuse to stop, but they want to maintain that relationship. So there's a lack of places to go, but there's also a lack of professional knowledge really around how complex it is.
And that's the scary part, isn't it? Because we always sort of assume that as professionals, got it all sewn up, know exactly what's going on and everything's in place in terms of policies, procedures, everything else. And it's not the case. And especially with something like domestic abuse that, is so insidious and on so many levels, that how do you, and what we're talking about essentially is a relationship with another person that you are bonded to them one way or another, whether it's your parent, whether it's your partner, whoever it is. And to say to somebody, when I did the podcast with Sam Fisher, one of the things that we were saying drives you mad is when people say, why don't they just leave? Or why don't they just get another carer? Or why don't they just, it's not that simple. And that's the kind of stigma that needs to be broken down. And that's where the understanding needs to open up more in terms of it will never be that straightforward. even if we do start to get things right, it will always be a very complex subject to talk about, because you're talking about emotions, you're talking about bonds that have been made, and telling somebody that they have to just walk away. It's never going to be that straightforward. And I think we said this in the previous podcast, if you were leaving a healthy relationship just because it didn't work out, how hard is that? Add domestic abuse to the mix. Now thinking about it, add caring to the mix as well. It's just, okay, yeah, no, it's not that straightforward at all. So
no, it's definitely not. And a lot of funding for domestic abuse support services focuses on an end goal, a sort of crisis intervention, really, short-term support until that relationship has ended. But caring being one example, but in some relationships, actually, that support around the abuse does need to be ongoing, and that support may be needed for a number of years, because the person wants to maintain that caring role, but just needs some support around the abuse.
And in the meantime, their life is just passing them by, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking, and I think it's amazing that you're doing this project, and I'll be fascinated if we're allowed a sneak peek at some point.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping that we're going to. I'm doing part of the project within Cambridgeshire County Council with my role there, and we are working very closely with carer support organisations, not just for carers who support older people, but also there's quite often parent carers who support an adult child who might have substance misuse issues, mental health issues. So we are working really closely with those organisations to see how we can raise the awareness amongst carers, but also make sure that the right sort of support, the support they want, is in place before we do that. Because obviously there's no point raising awareness and then people start coming forward and there's no support. So it's quite a slow process, because part of the issue is that there is actually not really any data gathered around abusive carers. So national surveys like the Carers UK survey that they're actually running at the moment, but there's also smaller local carer surveys that's managed by NHS Digital. None of them actually ask about carer abuse, which is a difficult question to ask. You wouldn't want it popping up in the middle of a questionnaire, but unfortunately, as you probably know, if there's no hard data about how much something is an issue, to get the sort of the funding for services.
Not going to change.
So that's why it's quite a slow process, trying to gather some data first, and then hopefully eventually make a difference, really.
Oh, that would be, well, amazing. And that kind of leads on to one of the things, I think I'd said this to you recently, that I'm going to try and do with each podcast is ask 2 questions to the professional and see what the responses are. And I think more often than not, they'll probably be quite similar. And I think you've already probably answered them anyway. But one of them I was asking was, why do we think it is so difficult for society to talk about domestic abuse? Why is it? I mean, in some ways it's pretty obvious why it's hard to talk about, but then I would imagine in this day and age now, where we're quite willing to chat about anything, why is it still the subject that people shy away from talking about?
I think there are some similarities to mental health. I mean, we've obviously seen a change in that in recent years. People are more willing to talk about their mental health. But with mental health, there isn't anybody that's to blame. There's no sort of person that's responsible for mental health, or for poor mental health. But obviously with domestic abuse, you're talking about that somebody is an abuser, and those abusers are our friends, family, professionals that we come across, colleagues, etc. And obviously they keep those abusive behaviours hidden most of the time, because if everybody, it's like the thing that if all sort of murderers went around looking like
looking like
murderers, you would know, wouldn't they? So I think that makes it really difficult for people to even think about the fact that somebody could be an abuser, somebody that they know. But when it does come out, it also means, or if it does come out, it means that people are less willing to believe what's happening. And that is obviously part of the control that an abuser has. You know, if you tell anybody, nobody will believe you because I'm,
Absolutely.
you know, so well loved in the community, whatever. And I think that all sort of works together to make it just really harder for people to speak out, really, and to talk about it. But I also think that sentencing around domestic abuse crime is it does play a part, because when you look at sort of reports of I know somebody who might be sentenced for an attack on a stranger, and somebody who receives a prison sentence for domestic abuse, they can be very different. And I think the public tend to think that the longer the sentence, then the worse the crime was. So when you've got somebody who's only sentenced to 6 weeks for a physical assault, then we tend to think, well, it can't have been that.
It can't be that bad.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So and even and even getting to the point where, you know, actually as a victim going to the police, you know, thinking, will I be believed? Is it just going to be a he said, she said scenario? And like you say, you know, abusers are very cunning, they're very clever, more often than not, as we know now, in very professional roles. So hide in plain sight, you know, and you look like you're the person that's lost the marbles, sort of thing. Or even worse, you don't even know you're suffering abuse. You don't even know you're going through an abusive relationship. That's just become the norm. So I think it is going to be something that is going to take a very long time to slowly be able to talk about more openly, and hopefully doing things like this is making a bit of a difference with any luck. And the other question I was going to ask was, the other one I was want to know the answer to is, how could we potentially then break down those barriers? You know, I'm always thinking, is it more education? Do we need to have kind of education in schools earlier? You know, because there's a lot of support services and charities that go into secondary schools and talk about healthy relationships. But for me, and this is just my personal opinion, is that too late? You know, is it kind of some behaviors have already manifested themselves, especially if it's, say, child to parent abuse? You know, is it, how do we have that conversation earlier? Is it knowledge? You know, how do we kind of break down those stigmas and barriers? Another tough question.
So in terms of children and young people, the mandatory RSE that actually does start in primary schools, and in primary schools they look at things like respectful relationships. What does a respect look like in a friendship? Because a lot of those behaviours within intimate relationship or a family relationship that are abusive could be reflected in a sort of friend relationship as well. So they do start looking at that at quite a young age. And obviously as children move into secondary school, that focuses much more on intimate relationships and sexual consent and things like that. So I think that is there. But it's also something that sits alongside, particularly when you get to secondary school, you know, trying to work hard for your GCSEs and sort of things like that are probably not as important. But then equally, if you leave it until the child is older, and it's too late by then. I think it's really difficult to get that balance. I think there does need to be increased awareness, and that covers all victims, not just the typical sort of younger female victim with children, that you know, sort of other victims, male victims, particularly older men as victims, and people with disabilities, that is those sort of different images are used in awareness more. But going back to what I said a few minutes ago, you've got to have the support in place if you're going to,
if you're going to do it.
awareness. And I think that there is a gap in that long-term support, and there's also a gap in adults who experienced abuse as a child, but they now as an adult realise that what happened within that, their family was domestic abuse, but there isn't any support for them now, not because they're going to that old thing of people who are abused become abusers, not because of that at all, because that's absolutely not true, but to help them to understand what happened to them as a child through their now adult lens, so that they can have more awareness themselves and share that awareness with other people and talk about it more. I think those sort of things need to be done, and there is a gap there, and I do also wish that the police and media, when there's an incident, a homicide or a serious assault, would stop saying that it's an isolated incident. Because
it's anything but.
Exactly. When you get sort of people interviewed saying, oh, this doesn't happen in our village. Actually, in that street where there might have unfortunately been a domestic homicide, it's not isolated, because I bet if you knocked on doors along there, you would find,
statistically, how many people would you find, how many children, how many older people? Exactly. And you're right, it is, I think it's the impression that's been allowed to kind of perpetuate over the years that have made it worse. Like you say, it is usually the image of, it's either a woman, that is the victim, whereas actually, we need a kind of plethora of people as images of victims, because that's what it is. Victims come in every shape, size, age, doesn't matter who you are, that's the way it is. And you can't change, well, hopefully we can change that, but at the moment we can't change that. So what we need to do is be able to talk about, and I think talking about it, that's, it's there's a saying that my husband always says, is nothing will change if nothing changes, and it's such a simple thing to say, but it's so true. So if we don't talk about it, if we do keep it as something like, oh no, we can't discuss that, we can't have that conversation. I know myself, when I've gone to events, and people will see that poster that says domestic abuse, and it's something they just walk past, because it's almost like they don't want to be associated with it. And yet, if you looked at their life, there will be somebody, whether it's a friend, whether it's a work colleague, there will be somebody they know that is either experiencing or has been impacted by abuse at some point in their life. So it isn't something that is just a marginalized group that goes through it. No, it is in every area, in every walk of life. So yeah, you're right, awareness is the key, isn't it, really? And I think it's getting it right with awareness. I think that's the thing, is just trying to get it right, but we may get there one day. You never know. But I am very, very grateful to you, because I know I keep saying this because professionals taking time out to come and do this when you're so busy, but I just think it's such a good sort of platform to be able to have it on the website, and if you want to do a guest blog as well, I think you'd be incredible. And be able just to have that information to hand in one accessible place, where it doesn't matter if you're a teenager, it doesn't matter if you're an older person, you can go and read up on anything you want to find out about, and it's all there. So hopefully, it's early days, isn't it, but we might get there.
I think people like you that are doing things like this and doing that awareness raising, that's what is needed, because I think things that come from government or police can put people off a bit, but when it's just like this, people having
we're normal people, we're talking about abuse. Yes, we do. Well, thank you so much. I'm exceedingly grateful, and obviously this podcast will be over on the website probably by the end of today, and until next time, thank you so much.
Thank you.